Welcome to episode 61 of the Filmumentaries podcast. 61A, the 18th prime number, the code for international calls to Australia. 61 is the current age of Michael J. Fox, I think, as well. Anyway, none of this is relevant to today's episode. It's just 61. It just seems significant somehow. I'm a day late, as once again work got in the way, as did a rare opportunity to take a day off, having worked lots in October. So despite this being the 1st of November 2022, this is in fact October's second episode. As you can probably hear, I've got a cold as well, so apologies for the sound of my voice, a bit sniffly. Thanks for joining me again, or perhaps for the first time. If this is your first time, you've got about 70 hours of conversation to check out in the 60 other episodes. I've been lucky enough to speak to some great people about their work and their time in the film industry. Coming up, for instance, I have Stu Phillips, composer, probably most famous for Battlestar Galactica's theme and the Knight Rider theme. That should be great fun. Stu doesn't do Zoom, so I'm calling him on a phone, a landline, as I did with Nilo Rodis for episode 17 early last year. Looking forward to that. I also have VFX legend Dennis Muren for one of November 2022's episodes. In fact, I'm chatting with Dennis this Thursday. I'm in the middle of research right now, rewatching Light and Magic, going over lots of other interviews and videos and documentaries that he's appeared in. But also I'm kind of thinking maybe I should just stop after today, because I want to find out more about him. I don't want to go armed with all of the answers already. But yeah, I'm really looking forward to that one. He's a real hero of mine, a name that I've been aware of since I was about 5 years old. So for this episode, number 61, I have ex-ILM and Lucasfilm producer Jim Bloom, a colleague of Dennis Muren, of course. Jim started his career proper on Lucas's American Graffiti and then navigated a very interesting path through numerous titles with some amazing directors. I spoke with him just a couple of weeks ago over Zoom. We had a very long conversation, so this will be a two-parter. I warn you now, Jim does go off on a few tangents, but they're always interesting, always entertaining. Why they might not be specifically about the films that we usually talk about in this podcast, I think it's really great to get that kind of perspective from somebody who was there at the time, and I know you're going to enjoy it. Jim speaks so enthusiastically anyway about his time in the industry, so I'm sure you'll enjoy it as much as I did. So here's my chat with movie producer Jim Bloom, and I'll be back at the end for a bit more jabbering on. Jim, where did it all begin for you? Your career in film and TV, you've worked on some hugely successful films and contributed to their success, I'm sure. But what was the starting point for you?
The starting point was getting interested in finding a career and then finding a career in the movie business and then pursuing that interest to the point of saying, well, if this is something I want to do, it would be a good idea to find a job. And I started looking for work everywhere. When I was a student at UC Berkeley, and in my freshman year, my brother, who also works in the movie business, but he works in the advertising end, or did, lent me an 8mm Bolex camera, which I still have. And I made a short movie with some other kids. We were in a physics for non-majors class at Cal, which is the nickname for the university. And rather than doing a written project on something having to do with the physical world or universe or whatever, we decided to make a movie. And the movie was called Mr. Physics Meets the Frisbee. And the idea was that there was this graduate student in physics who locked himself away in a garret somewhere because he had this idea, which was to invent a flying disc, which was the Frisbee. And he labored for many years, and then he went out to this area at the campus that was called Sproul Plaza, which at the time, sort of all of the great Frisbee artists used to throw their Frisbees around, and do it very beautifully, around the back and through the legs and over the head and jumping. And he goes out there with his little Frisbee and he finds out, oh my God, I've just spent all this time of my life inventing something that's already been invented. And in his despair, he decides to walk to the Campanile, which is a replica of the Campanile in Venice. It's this very, very tall clock tower, to jump off and kill himself. And being a physicist, he has to figure out once he jumps how fast he'll go, how quickly he'll accelerate, and what kind of an impact he'll leave on the ground. So it's a suicide story with that. It's kind of a dark comedy. Anyway, that was the movie. And what I found out was that, well, this is really enjoyable. I really enjoyed the process and the fun. So after doing that, I said, gee, maybe I should try and find some work. And then the next year when I was a student, whenever there was because there always were European documentary film crews that came to the campus to shoot, because at that point, it was 1973. So, no, 1971. So we weren't that many years past the riots of 68 and 69 and years past the free speech movement, and all of these things made Berkeley such a hotbed of activity. This is what's known as how to make a short story long. And I used to follow documentary filmmakers around, and whenever I saw one, I would say, "Can I help? I'm interested in film and filmmaking, and I'll help for free." And I did, and I got hired by a couple of guys. And one of them was an Italian who was making a documentary for RAI TV, who I drove all over the Bay Area, and he never paid me back my gas money. And the other, my first good lesson about the movie business, about not, watch out for people who will lie to you. And then the other lesson was part of my early Me Too experience, I'll say. I was driving a German documentary around, and while I was driving him, he put his hand on my thigh. And I realized very quickly that he was not only interested in me carrying his camera equipment, but he had more in mind, which was, well and good, but not my persuasion. So I brushed his hand away and said, "No, you got the wrong guy here. I'm not interested in that." And that was fine. So I worked with, him for a few days and blah, blah, blah. But that, it was sort of another, somebody trying to take advantage. It was like one was not getting paid and the other one was somebody trying to take advantage of you. So they were both, in retrospect, very good early lessons for me. So I then spent, more time talking to people and trying to find work during my summer break to see if I could find a job. And I met a filmmaker named John Cordy, who's a pretty well-regarded filmmaker in the United States, kind of an independent filmmaker. He directed The Diary of Miss Jane Pittman and had done some other independent movies. And then years later, I was his assistant director, his second assistant director on a TV movie called Farewell to Manzanar. And then 3 years ago, when I moved out to Point Reyes, he lived a block away from me. And so I used to see him all the time walking in the neighborhood and would talk to him. Unfortunately, he passed away earlier this year, which is quite sad. But so John was indirectly responsible. And I called him for months trying to see if I could come over and meet him in person, because I knew that talking to people on the phone was worthless. And the only way to kind of get your foot in the door was to make a personal impression by somebody meeting you, so they would associate a face with a name. And John, I think I wore him down. And John said, "Okay, come on over, you can meet me." And I knocked on the door. And I joked with him later about this. He never invited me in. He was on the inside of the door and I was on the porch outside, and we talked for like 5 or 10 minutes. But he said something to me, and what he said to me is, there's this guy named George Lucas, and he's making this movie over in San Rafael this summer called American Graffiti. So you should call him. Maybe they need some help. And I knew who George was because I had seen THX 1138 and loved it, was really impressed, and knew that he was a young up-and-coming filmmaker and he lived in the Bay Area. So I went right home and called the production office and got the production secretary on the phone, and much to my complete shock, she said, "Yeah, we're looking for somebody. Can you come over tomorrow to interview?" And it was like, of course, and I went over the next day and I interviewed with George and with Gary Kurtz, who is producer on Graffiti and then on Star Wars and then on Empire. And I think I said the magic words during the interview. Other than that, they must have liked me, was that I'll work for free, and then when they hired me, they said, "No, that's okay." Well, I used to do a Gary imitation. I used to do a George imitation too. But he said, "Well, I'll work for free." I said, "No, that's not necessary." He said, "Oh, we'll pay you a little bit. We'll pay you a little money. We'll pay you $10 a day."
And what was the role?
I was a production assistant, and my responsibility was casting and working all of the extra cars, period cars on the movie. That was my job. And there were a couple of lucky things about it. The most lucky thing was that I had spent that springtime at school running every afternoon. So I was running about 3 miles every afternoon for my health. So I became a little, what's the expression, fleet of foot, because I spent all my time on the set running up and down the street, setting background action with period cars. And so that was good to, had I not done that, I would have been like, huffing and puffing and dragging my butt.
Sure.
But I was able to run everywhere, and we shot at nights and only for 5 weeks. So that was the first feature that I got to work on. And
And
so years
did you know cars? Sorry, did you know cars though? Like, did you have
no,
knowledge of cars? No.
no, no, but didn't know cars, and but I knew old cars, but I had I grew up back east outside of New York City,
Mm.
and so I was not part of the car culture milieu of California in any way, of lowriders, of car cruising, or anything like that. So it was all sort of something that I learned, which is really one of the beauties of working on movies, that every time you work on a different movie, you take a crash course
Mm.
in whatever it is that you're working on. So it's really, it's kind of unique that way. Every time, either every episode of a TV show or every movie, documentary, whatever it would be.
So
So
George and Gary, really, it sounds like they employed you on the basis of your kind of your personality and your disposition more than anything else.
I think that they saw that I was bright, intelligent, and eager
Mm.
and genuine, and was like, I'll do anything. I just want a chance. I just want to break in.
Sure.
So I think that I must have had qualities that maybe they also had when they were younger too.
Mm.
Trying to get it. It's very tough to get a job in the movie business.
Yeah.
So I'm going to jump around a little bit. So before I got the job on Graffiti, my brother had been working in LA. He had a good friend who was the writer of The Andromeda Strain, a Robert Wise movie. And this writer's name was Nelson Gidding, who was a well-regarded professional screenwriter. And Nelson had a friend who had a TV commercial in San Francisco, and Nelson arranged an interview with me to go meet this guy at the TV production company, company. And the first thing the guy said to me, which I've also never forgotten, is, "What do you want to work in the movie business for?" You know, he was a guy who must have been in his late 40s, early 50s, who had been doing it for a long time. And what do you want to work in the movie business for? And I'd never forgotten that question. That question sort of resonated with me years and years into my career, which is like, yeah, what do I want to work in the movie? Anyway,
You have to
that was
kind of remind yourself of the reason that you do want to
exactly,
work in the movie. Yeah.
exactly. I do get reminded. I get reminded when I talk to people about movies, and I talk to, about acting and story, and the whole, everything that goes into making a motion picture, and the people that I've met, and those conversations, and
Yeah.
a lot of the great directors. And just this morning, as a fluke, I I drove my wife is flying to New York right now to go visit my son, who's 31, and I took her to the airporter, that bus that takes you from outside the city and town, that gives you a
Hmm.
lift to the airport. And we're waiting there. And as I'm waiting there, all of a sudden, this Tesla, I'm parked, pulls up in front of me. And who pops out of the Tesla but Dennis Muren?
Huh.
And I haven't seen Dennis in probably 8 or 10 years. I used
Mm.
to run into him often flying back and forth to LA or at social events or stuff like that. But I'm a huge fan of Dennis. I really like Dennis. He's really a great guy. And I really enjoyed working with him because he's so talented and so smart. And he's a real genuine person. And we worked together very closely on Empire and Jedi, and I worked very closely in setting ILM up at Empire. Anyway, and Dennis jumps out of the car. I saw him and I jumped out of the car and I went, "Dennis," and he was dropping his daughter, who I thought was his wife because she looks just like his wife, but I didn't know. All I saw was an attractive woman with a mask on. And it wasn't his wife, Zara. It was his daughter, whose name is Gwen. And I said, "Hi, Zara." And, Dennis said, "Oh, no, that's my daughter. She looks just like my," anyway. So she got on the bus, my wife got on the bus, and then Dennis and I, gabbed for like 15 or 20 minutes, like, "Hi, how are you? What are you doing? What's up? Blah, blah." And it was just really nice to see Dennis because it's sort of like in my career, there are people who I've worked with who I have very warm feelings for, that I really liked.
Mm.
And Dennis was one of those guys. So it
Nice.
doesn't.
That's nice to sort of jump straight back in with him, just sort of get chatting and
Oh yeah,
after all
well,
that time.
these are like, it's like meeting your old high school friends,
Sure. Yeah.
friends from your childhood, that people who you shared so much time with, that you kind of like, it's like easy to see them again, like each other so well.
Yeah. Yeah.
Shared, enough laughs together prior, laughs, heartaches, disappointments, pluses, all those things, that it was very easy just to say hi, and talk for a little bit, and blah blah.
Nice. So take me back then. Take me back to those night shoots on American Graffiti. We've heard the stories of George kind of falling asleep and deciding to do it in coverage and sort it out in the edit and all of that kind of stuff. Um, what were those night shoots like? Were they, as intense and as long as we've heard?
Well, they weren't as long as you would think, because in retrospect, we shot in the middle of summertime. So we began principal photography in like late June. And, here, the summer solstice is June 21st. So it's like the longest day of the year. And so you're dealing with the shortest nights. So we used to get to location at like 6:30 or 7 at night and get ready, and so that when it got dark enough, you could go shoot. But we were always preparing. A lot of graffiti was shot in automobiles, in cars, rounds. There's always people gabbing and talking in cars all the time. And because it was the first movie that I worked on, it was only when we shot sets, location set pieces, that I was able to get close to the camera, because other times I was running up and down the street setting background action with the cars, and I wasn't close enough. But when I could, I always tried to get close to the camera. And actually, one of the fondest memories I have of graffiti was driving Wolfman Jack to the airport. Wolfman Jack, after having been in California for a couple of years, I knew who he was, and I knew his voice. And on Graffiti at the time, none of these guys were big stars. None of them. Ron Howard I knew, because actually I didn't know him. When I was 8 years old, my parents took a trip to California, and my dad had a school friend when he grew up in New York, whose name was Stubby K, who was an actor, like a character actor from the 40s and 50s. He was in Guys and Dolls, and he was a real character. And I think he used to do a show in Vegas and stuff. And I think Stubby was working on a TV show called The Millionaire. I don't know if you remember that. It was a great old TV show from the 60s. We went to Desilu Studios. I'd never been to a movie studio before, to watch them shoot a little bit, which was like, oh, this is cool. And then while we were there, we also walked over to another stage and watched them shoot the Andy Griffith Show. So I got to see Ronnie Howard working when he was like a little bit, my age or a little bit younger, and anyway, so it shows that Ronnie's working on American Graffiti. When you think of the cast on American Graffiti, it was really quite remarkable, because one of the guys who helped with the casting was a man named Fred Roos, who worked with Francis a lot. And so Fred brought in a lot of young actors, and a lot of the young actors he brought in were, he had Ronnie Howard, and he had Richard Dreyfuss. I became very friendly with Richard, because I worked with Richard on Close Encounters, years later. So he and I knew each other really well. And then Cindy Williams, who went on to have a great career in television, very successful TV career. And who else was on it? Well, Paul Lamont was on it. Bo Hopkins was on it. A bunch of other people who all later went on and had good careers. Charlie Martin Smith, who later became a TV director and,
Mm.
acting and working and stuff. And um, oh, and
Harrison
um,
Ford.
exactly, of course, Harrison had a very small part. Harrison only worked for like a couple of days. And I then worked with Harrison on Graffiti, on The Conversation, and then on, the Star Wars movies, on Empire and Jedi. So I got to know Harrison, pretty well back then and kind of like knew him when, so to speak. And it's awful that I'm forgetting this actress's name, but I'll probably remember it in a minute. Kathleen Quinlan was also on it. Now, Kathleen played the leading lady in a movie that I produced later called A Warning Sign that I was going to talk, I'll talk to you about later on, which is about an accident in a jean splicing lab. But because I met Kathleen on Graffiti, I knew and then followed her career. I knew what a great actress she was, and she really is a wonderful actress. But for some reason, it's really funny how some actors or actresses are incredibly talented, but they never really have a chance to break out. Kathleen was also in Apollo 13. She played one of the astronauts' wives. I think she played um, Tom Hanks's wife,
I think
actually in
you're right.
Apollo.
Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah, yeah.
She was also in The Doors, where she
Mm.
played a reporter who then became, a lover of, Val Kilmer, Jim Morrison, had a
Hmm.
very big part in that as well. So she's really a great actress, great actress. Anyway, but so that was so fascinating about Graffiti is that all these young actors who were cast,
Mm.
you so many of them went on to great careers. But back to like working at nights. So we had very short nights. And I don't remember George falling asleep too much, but I'm sure everybody was kind of falling asleep from time to time. That's the way night work is. It always takes, I always found that anytime you start doing nights, it takes about a week to adjust your schedule. You go sleep at 8 or 9 in the morning and you wake up at 3 or 4 in the afternoon and you start your day and you're up all night long. And it's a little, it takes a while. I don't know if people ever get used to that sort of thing.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. I know it well, sadly.
but it was, yeah, oh, you do, huh? Oh, are you? Because if you have shows that are going on around the world in different time zones, you have to.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, yeah. Especially now with things remotely done as well. So I'd normally be in Australia, but now I just have to be on the time of Australia, for
Well, that,
instance. Yeah.
then what's Australia to you?
12
It,
hours difference.
12 hour a day ahead and 12 hours difference. 12. Well, that's exactly where that's the worst.
This top's completely upside down. Yeah.
The upside down. I know because my son lives in New Zealand now, and
Hmm.
it's interesting. Well, for me in California, he's only 5 hours 5 hours behind us, but
Hmm.
he's a day ahead, but five. I do it. It's easier math for me than to subtract five than it is to add 19.
Right.
An awkward number. You know, you get used to it, but it's just 19's funny, especially got a 12-hour clock. It's not anyway.
So
So,
that work you did on American Graffiti for Gary and George, obviously, it went well. The film was a huge success. I
yeah,
think at one time, I think it was the biggest profit compared to the budget of a movie ever.
yes, yes,
Um,
yeah, it was. That's right.
and then that kind of led to you being part of their kind of team in a way. You went off to do other things, but then you came back. So what did you do immediately after American Graffiti?
Right after American Graffiti, I went to work on a documentary with a documentary filmmaker whose name was Tom Smith, who I later hired to take my place as the general manager of ILM. But he was making a documentary about Native Americans up in the Seattle region,
Hmm.
and he needed a, kind of runner gopher assistant camera person. And so I got hired on there. I met him through my brother who had worked with him. And I worked on that we went on location for about a week or something up in and around Seattle, which was interesting for me because I'd never worked on a small movie like that before. And I had to learn how to, handle a camera and, put lenses in and out and change magazines and, the technical stuff. Because at that point in my career, I really didn't know where I wanted to direct my efforts. What was interesting about this business and where would I best suit in and, how to apply those interests. And then after that, because of Graffiti, Francis Coppola was making the conversation. And because of the work that I did on Graffiti, I got hired onto the conversation. Because I think principally because the fellow who I worked with on Graffiti most directly, who was the second assistant director, was a man named Chuck Myers. And Chuck became the first assistant director on the conversation, and he needed to hire a second AD. And so what was interesting was that at the time, Francis made the conversation as a production of a company called the Directors Company. And it was a company that was formed with Francis, Billy Friedkin, and Peter Bogdanovich, Paramount, to make like a certain number of low budget movies for Paramount. And the conversation was the first one. And Francis worked out a deal with the Directors Guild of America to hire two assistant director trainees for the San Francisco Bay Area. And I got one of the spots. So I got into the Directors Guild as an assistant director trainee, which was like a total coup.
Yeah.
Because the only way to get into the Directors Guild at the time was to go through the assistant director training program, which had been around for a few years. And the only way to get into the program was to qualify by taking a psychological aptitude test that they used to give to fighter pilots.
Huh.
Okay. It was one of the psychology tests. What kind of person are you? Are you psychologically equipped to become an assistant director? I like to laugh about this stuff now. And so they're looking for certain qualities and certain skill sets and who you are and how you think and how you react to stuff and where your emotional levels are. Are you bipolar or not? I'm joking, but all of those things. So a lot of the assistant director trainees who I met, years later were like, these are really straight arrow guys, really, because they were looking to develop assistant directors, who were, buttoned up, kind of almost ex-military, knew how to take an order, give an order, you know, you know, move the, move the battle forward, so to
Mm-hmm.
speak.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, I got a spot and another guy got a spot. And so although we were the trainees, we really did the job of the second assistant director on the conversation. And so that was my second movie. And it was like, oh, I get to work with George Lucas, then I get to work with Francis Coppola, and it's like, isn't life dandy? And so that was great because I started working again with Haskell Wexler, the cameraman who I met on Graffiti and who I became friendly with and really, really liked. Great guy, real radical, and um, and then Gene Hackman and Terry Garr and John Cazale, Alan Garfield, Harrison Ford, Cindy Williams. Again, Cindy was on that movie, and Frederick Forrest, and I think I probably mentioned Harrison was in it, and Bobby Duvall was in it, which was also, so what a great kid, and what a great movie. It's just,
It holds up so well, that movie. I watched it because I interviewed Walter Murch last year a couple of
oh,
times
you
for this
did, oh
podcast.
nice,
Yeah.
oh great, oh great.
And I got back in. I hadn't seen those movies since I was in college, and yeah, I was surprised just how well that kind of held up. That movie really, I think there's something about those movies from that time, from that kind of mid to late '70s. There just seems to be a ramp up in the quality of the storytelling somehow,
Oh, absolutely. Well, not
particularly
only that,
amongst those young directors.
I also think that The Conversation was one of the early movies, and with thanks to Walter, that really took advantage of sound,
Mm,
what you can do with sound. It
absolutely, yeah, yeah.
really did a beautiful job with that, and it was such a good screenplay. Showing the demise of the bugger, the detective knowing, and denying he's involved in a murder, and not wanting to admit to it. And it's an excellent, really an excellent movie. And I think it was well regarded in its day too. It was nominated for Directors Guild and Best Director at the Academy. And
Mm. And
yeah,
gave
but
birth to the word sound designer
yeah,
for
exactly.
Walter. Yeah.
And wonderful film. So that was my second movie. And
I was going
that,
to say, actually, Walter told me, and I don't know if you might have been there at the time, but he told me at one point when they decided that the tapes were going to be stolen. It originally wasn't in the script, I think. The girl that stays over for the night with Gene Hackman's character. They
oh,
had to shoot a pickup using Gene Hackman's brother
uh-huh.
from behind, so that
Right.
you could roughly see, that it was not. You couldn't tell it was not him. But he said they shot it on a particular stage where if they'd have turned the camera 180 degrees, you would have seen Jack Nicholson shooting Chinatown with Roman Polanski.
Yeah, I wasn't around. It must have been during post-production. There
Yeah,
must have been
right.
a shot that they needed to do all that.
Yeah, cool
No,
little
it didn't.
story though. Just those worlds kind of colliding.
Absolutely. Francis must have needed a set to shoot something, come in and sneak a shot.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Lansky said, "Come on over and use, what do you need?" I said, "Oh, I just a wall and a thing and a that, and
yeah. A couple of tapes and a telephone. Um,
and Gene's brother was his stand-in and sort of his stunt double,
oh, is that right?
for certain things. Yeah, the Hackman brothers. Yeah, they were quite a pair of those two.
I
Yeah.
get the sense that Gene Hackman was a very formidable character. Like he strikes me as the sort of person that didn't suffer fools. I would imagine he.
You're absolutely right about that. He had a good sense of humor. He was very serious. He wasn't, a hell well, good fellow, kind of happy-go-lucky kind of guy. I think he had some demons that he was, wrestling with and stuff. But all of those things, made him the great actor that he was. And he also used to do great comedy too. In some of the things he was in. He was in that La Cage aux Folles, where he
Yeah,
plays. He's very funny. He's very funny. But I think that was later in his career. And when he did The Conversation, it wasn't far after having done The French Connection,
mm,
a year or two, and his career was just, moving forward and stuff. Yeah, but he was very, Gene was a serious. It's like, don't fuck with Gene. He was a
yeah,
serious.
really.
He didn't. He just wanted information straight, and et cetera. And I like Gene.
Yeah,
And it was great to watch him work. He was so talented. All those guys. It was just such a treat to watch them all, and watch Bobby Duvall again.
oh yeah,
Watch Bobby Duvall work. And I worked with him again later on two other movies. I worked with Bobby again on the Sam Peckinpah film, The Killer Elite,
mm,
and I worked with him on Invasion of the Body Snatchers. He plays a character, he just comes by to, he kind of did a cameo, kind of showed up for a day or two, and I think he played a priest or something, and for a scene in the park, but Duvall was, no, no, that was on Body Snatchers, yeah, the Phil Campbell movie,
and
yeah.
how did you get then involved in Close Encounters? What was the kind of catalyst behind that?
So I'll take you through a couple of other movies. So I
Mm,
worked with Myers on American Graffiti and then The Conversation. And then as soon as The Conversation was over, my brother had gotten a job working as a production assistant on a Bob Altman movie called Thieves Like Us.
yes, yeah,
And if you know, it's a wonderful movie. And
yeah,
so, here I'm going from Lucas to Coppola to Altman. It's like, how many lotteries can you win in a row? Right? And so I went down to Jackson, Mississippi, and worked with him down there, and with his repertoire, his group, production people and actors as well, with Keith Carradine, Shelley Duvall, John, Burt Remsen, that whole group of guys down there, and that was a wonderful experience. Really great to watch Altman work, because he was another. All three of these guys are very different filmmakers. All very different. So that was over, and I came back, and then I wanted to keep working because I wanted to keep going through my trainee days so that I could, become a second AD. And I called up, got the name. They were shooting the Streets of San Francisco TV show, and I called up the production manager, and I went over to introduce myself, basically saying, "I'm here if you need some help." I didn't want to work on TV, I thought, um, but I was around, and it was like, if you've got busy days and you need an extra, trainee, additional, assistant director type, please call me. I'd love to come to work. And being the smart production manager that he was, he said, "You're hired." And I went, "What?" He said, "Yeah, you're hired. I want you full time. You start such and such." And I went, "Oh, well, I hadn't thought about that." And he said, "No, this is a great opportunity." He kind of, smart, he talked me into it. So I got hired as an assistant director trainee on the Streets of San Francisco TV show, which was, Michael Douglas and Carl Malden, and Carl is one of the great actors of all time, and it wasn't until I was into the show a little bit more that I realized who I was working with and what a treat it was. So I went to work as a trainee on Streets, and got to know Michael very well. And the interesting thing about working on the TV show was that TV is, really quick. And the way we were doing the show all over San Francisco, we were shooting an hour in 7 days. Every episode was 7 days long. That's really fast for like 50 pages. So, you're shooting 7 pages a day. We were moving, 2 or 3 locations a day. We were doing stage work. Every week we had a different director. And so the first season was 23 episodes, and then the second season was 23 episodes. That's a lot of work. And so I really kind of cut my teeth. I learned the bad things and the good things about doing quick production work. And so I was on Streets for 2 years. And then when the second season was over, I was eligible to be a second AD.
Right.
And so the second and during this whole time, I had kept up with Chuck Myers, who was the assistant director on The Conversation. He and I became very friendly, and he kept doing other things. He worked on Godfather 2. I don't know if he worked on Apocalypse. I don't think he worked on Apocalypse. I have to check Chuck's. Chuck has worked with great directors throughout his whole career. And he, trying to think when it was. So I think I worked on Streets. I kind of, it's like you figure out the chronology of all of this stuff now. Worked on Streets. I finished on Streets. And then I immediately got a job as a second assistant director with John Cordy, this guy who had introduced me to George years earlier, because he was doing a movie called Farewell to Manzanar, which was about the Japanese internment camps in World War II. And I was the second AD, and it was my first job, as a second, though I had sort of done it before on some of these other movies. And worked on that, and then Chuck Myers called me back again. And Chuck was working on Bound for Glory with Hal Ashby, another great director, and one of my favorites.
Birth of the Steadicam as well, that movie. I talked to Garrett Brown about that.
First, and Haskell Wexler was the director of photography, who I had worked with on, on Graffiti and a little bit on The Conversation, and had kept up with these people. And I've got to somehow get to 1978, 77, because that's when Star Wars came out. I'm not quite sure yet. This was in 19. We worked on that, and I think Bound for Glory maybe was in 74. We shot it, came out in 75. But great film. Melinda Dillon, who I later worked with on Close Encounters, and working with Hal, and Bound for Glory was a really big movie. It was big, 300 extras, multi-cameras, cranes, big crew. It was a real big Hollywood movie, and none of the things I'd worked on before had been quite that big. But these were still kind of United Artists and movies, which was sort of more like of an independent studio, because they didn't have their own studio per se, like MGM or Universal or Warner Brothers or Paramount or stuff like that. And then after Bound for Glory was over, then Chuck got a phone call, because Clark Palo, who was the production manager on The Conversation — what a great name for a production manager. Can you think of a better name than Palo? So Clark was the production manager on The Conversation. He got hired by Columbia to go to work on Close Encounters with Steven. Steven hired Chuck Myers, and Chuck called me and said, Blum, I want you to come be my second AD on a Spielberg movie. And it was like, Spielberg? Where do I go? It's like, I'm there. So we went, and that's how I got onto Close Encounters, because Chuck hired me, and that's how I met Steven. And the great thing about Close Encounters was that the movie was so big. When we were shooting the Box Canyon set, that was where the mothership lands, all the stuff before and during, and all of the light configurations. And because we were shooting completely out of continuity, and also there's another reason for all of this. Chuck, who was the first AD, said, "Well," he said, "you go next to the camera. I can't deal with these guys anymore." And I said, well, what's not to deal with? Well, what to deal with was that Vilmos Zsigmond was the cameraman, who was a wonderful cameraman, and whose stuff I had seen and noticed on an Altman movie, on McCabe, and Mrs. Miller. And what a beautiful movie that was. And everything that Vilmos did was just like gorgeous. But the guys at Columbia insisted, because of the size of the movie, that Vilmos bring a gaffer out of LA whose name was Earl Gilbert, who was a real old Hollywood studio gaffer. They're the head chief electricians. And he had his own key grip. And Vilmos and Earl didn't get along. And because Close Encounters was so big, you've got the cameraman arguing with the gaffer, and Steven's like, big movie, and he's getting upset, and everybody's getting upset around the camera. And Myers was saying, I can't handle this. This is too much for me. He says, Bloom, you've got a much better temperament than I do. You go by the camera, you call the roll, and I'll go down, because we were shooting so many scenes out of continuity, because we had to shoot from high up in the Rock Canyon when Dreyfus and Melinda Dillon, Neary and Jillian come over the top. There's the landing area, and then they kind of slowly work their way down onto the floor, right, where he finally gets picked out, and he becomes one of the astronauts. So in order to do it, we couldn't keep jumping up here and jumping down there. We had to kind of shoot in continuity, because when you light this massive dirigible hangar, which is what our set was, it was the hardest movie that I'd ever worked on physically, because we were in Mobile, Alabama in the summertime. Now, being in Mobile in the summertime is like really, it's like 95 degrees and 95% humidity, and just like hot. And here we were shooting in this dirigible hangar that had been expanded and tented in. You know who you would love to talk to? Did you ever talk to Joe Alves? Did you ever talk to Joe? You did. Okay. He's just a wonderful guy, just a great guy, and he was the production designer. So Joe will tell you about, you should ask Joe sometimes about Vilmos and Earl Gilbert and Steven, and I mean, he probably remembers me too, and Chuck, and the whole group. And then the producer was Julia Phillips, who was "You'll Never Eat Lunch in This Town Again." It was really just a remarkable movie.
What did you think of those sets when you first saw them? Like, did you, the sense of scale? I mean, bigger than anything. I think there was a sign out, wasn't there? Not since Cecil B. DeMille, it said, or something on the side of the set.
We had more lights. There weren't any lights to rent in Hollywood, because they were all on our set in Mobile, Alabama. We had all of the arcs, which is what people used to use for the big lights. But we were also using these new lights that had just been developed recently called HMIs, which were instant on-off lights. The arcs, you used to turn them on, and it took a while for the carbon arc inside to burn up and get up to heat to push out its full illumination. The HMIs, what was so beautiful about them is there was like a light switch. You turned it on and it would, whoop, and you turn on and you get this incredibly bright, intense light. So if you remember some of the scenes at the railroad crossing,
Yep.
where he's looking at his maps and trying to figure everything out, and all of a sudden the light goes bump, it just like pops on, you know, it like gives him the sunburn on the side of his face. And those were the great HMI lights, that we used on the movie for the first time. But ringing the Box Canyon were all of these arcs. So there weren't any lights available. And it's like, we need a light. Sorry, they've got it on the Close Encounter set, which is why the head of production at Columbia, who is another old time guy named John Veach, was like the VP production or president of production at Columbia at the time. Wanted Earl Gilbert on the show because that Earl could handle getting the crews and getting the lights and figuring, it was a big deal power wise, to get all those lights working and a lot of electricity going through it. But so in Close Encounters, you take the heat, take the humidity, take the size of the set, all of the lights, pumping all of this heat down. We used to joke that the top of the catwalk where all the lights were made its own weather. It was so hot up there. We always thought like, oh, it's going to rain down here because it's so hot up there. And we were dealing generally every day with 15 cast members, 40 extras, all who had ongoing parts because they were the guys in, astrophysics and laser spectronomics and, all of these, the different little modules all around the Box Canyon. Every one had its own, own group of scientists. And then we had, 40 or 50 5-year-old ballet dancing students dressed up as ETs coming out of the mothership. Little girls, right, dressed up as ETs. And it was just like, after you worked, we were shooting 6-day weeks, Monday through Saturday, and by the time Saturday rolled around, everybody's eyes are like, wah, 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 because it was so difficult. And then, it's like, what else on top of that? And then things happen, like the tarp ripped off. Joe talks, I've heard Joe talk about that before. It's just a beautiful, we were out there and all of a sudden you could hear this gale come in off of the Gulf. It's 90 degrees, but all of a sudden you start to feel the temperature drop, from dropping from 90 to 80. Well, it doesn't seem like much, but when you're in 90-degree heat and it goes down 10 degrees, it's like, oh, it's getting cool. And then you hear the wind starting to whip, and then the wind is getting louder, and you hear the rain coming down. And all of a sudden, you're like looking beyond to where the tarp is, off to this black infinity, which is what it was supposed to be behind the mothership. And all of a sudden, you see the tarp going and hearing it, because it was sound and visual. You hear the tarp going, and this rip of the tarp from like top to bottom, from the tarp rips open. The wind is howling in, and the tarp is, and this dark set all of a sudden is lit, with like gray outside light pouring into the set. And it was like, and we're in the production group. And so we, first thing, make sure everybody's okay. And then it's like, fuck me, what do we shoot now? What do we, it's like, how long is it going to take to fix this? And where do we go while it's getting fixed so that we can keep working? Anyway, it was really quite
crazy.
It was really
crazy. It was something like several miles of blacktop, I think Joe told me. And
it was, yes.
it was just these insane numbers, because that film kind of had grown, because it's supposed to be like a small sci-fi movie, and because of the success of Jaws and everything else, Spielberg's now the wonder kid, and everybody wants to throw money in his direction, and it suddenly becomes this huge movie. And Joe has told me about how he was off scouting for Devil's Tower, and by the time he came back, this movie was this huge juggernaut. Yeah,
we were 2 weeks away from photography, and the studio said, Stephen, you have to cut 2 days out. If you don't cut, you can't shoot. We're canceling the movie. It's too expensive. And this is my personal story, is that I wish I would have learned. I wish I would have used the lesson that I learned that day later when I became a producer, but I didn't, and maybe I'll get to that later. But the studio said, cut 2 days out. So Clark and Chuck and I went to a meeting in Steven's office, and we brought the production board with us. And I don't know if people, I still use a production board because it's really easy to move strips around and to see a movie in its totality. Like, you want to see everything because that's how you get a view of what you're shooting. You know, every little scene has a, you know, a strip, and every little day is, you know, separating them all. And we walked into the meeting, and, you know, and Chuck and Clark said, we can't find 2 days. I don't know. We don't know where to find 2 days. And Steven said, give me the board. So we handed the board to Steven, and he took the board and he went, and he shook it. And 2 little black day strips randomly popped out. Popped out. He took the board, he put it down on the table. He grabbed the 2 days. He said, here are your 2 days. We're done. Steven knew that it was bullshit. Cut 2 days out. It's like, it doesn't matter. Just cut 2 days. Who cares where the 2 days are? Once we start shooting this movie, once we're 2, 3, 4 weeks into this movie, you know, it doesn't matter anymore, you know, because Steven knew a couple of things that I learned later was the studio gets pregnant. They can't stop a movie once you're 4 or 5 weeks into it. Okay. The other thing that he knew that I learned later when I became a studio executive is that the studio tells you you've got $20 million to make the movie. And the president of the studio tells his boss, whoever it is, that the picture is going to cost $24 million. So they put $24 million in their budget, and they tell you 20, you know, and everybody eating and peeing on everybody else all the way down the line, you know, and it's, you know, it's business. That's the way things happen. You know, everybody's covering their ass at every step, all the way up the ladder until you get to the top. So, and Steven knew that. So that's why he grabbed the board and went, whoa, 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 you know, out pop the days. And those are your 2 days. And we looked at it and was like, what 2 days are those? And it was like, it doesn't matter what they are. Just make it work. Make it work. So also on Close Encounters, there were 2 young writers who came on to do additional script work, who were Hal Barwood and Matthew Robbins. And Hal and Matthew had written Bingo Long and the Traveling All-Stars for MacArthur, and a few other movies. And this film was, it was very interesting because it was an idea that I think that Matthew may have come up with based on something else that Steven turned into Close Encounters. And they came in to do addition, and I first met them when they were doing pages. They would write pages and hand them to me, and I would take them as soon as they came, like hot off the press, and back to, you know, the production department to read them, understand them, break them down, and pass them out to all the departments because they were creating new scenes and changing old scenes. So we had to keep this big juggernaut of a group all on the same page of what we were shooting. And so I met Hal and Matthew then, and they were quite young. On Close Encounters, 1976, I was 23 when Close Encounters was shot. And I think Hal was, you know, Hal was probably 33 and Matthew was like 31 or something. They were young writers. And then later, Hal and Matthew wrote and directed Dragon Slayer, which we did visual effects work at ILM. And Matthew's first picture as a director was a movie called Corvette Summer, starring Mark Hamill and Annie Potts. Matthew called me and offered me my first job as a first assistant director. As soon as I became eligible, Matthew called me and said, I want you to be my AD. And I was like, great. And so I went down and did Corvette Summer with Matthew. And to this day, Matthew is still a good friend of mine, you know. And when Hal, I'm going to jump ahead a few years. So after Star Wars and after Empire and Jedi, Hal and Matthew were going to go make a picture for the Ladd company called The Grid. And The Grid was this wonderful movie about time travel. And the premise of the movie is that 4 people from the future have to transport themselves back to the past because somewhere in the past, like 2 or 3 or 400 years in the future. People speak a different language. Everything looks different. There's a mad scientist from the future who has gone back to the past, and in the future, he's unleashed something which is destroying our reality. And it's kind of like this kind of creeping, crystallizing thing that crawls like a blob, or not really, but if you kind of, it's more because of computer graphics at the time.
Mm.
It was, like squares and triangles.
Like
It was
pixelated, yeah.
pixelated, very geometric, like
Hmm.
early computer graphics. This was 1983, and it's like slowly creeping, eating up reality wherever you are, just like eating it up and changing it. And you can kind of see it coming, and everything is like getting crystallized and eaten and disappearing because of what the scientist did. So these four guys who had worked with this guy had gone mad. They have to come back to the past. But the thing about time travel is that, like in real life, in real travel, when you make a wrong turn, you wind up somewhere else on the map geographically. But in time travel, these four people, when something went wrong with their time transportation, they came down 20 years apart from one another.
Hmm.
So the first guy landed in 1957, and he's now aged another, 25 years. So this young kid who was 25 is now 50. And the other guys all came down, like 10 years apart, 5 years apart, they're all at different times. And they all came back, and they all sort of suffered from this personality dislocation with amnesia and who am I and what am I doing here? And so the beginning part of the movie is that our hero is a guy whose name was John Lackland. They find him floating underneath the Golden Gate Bridge.
Hmm.
He doesn't know who he is. And he's taken to a hospital. He's still alive. And he's kind of nursed back to health by a nurse. And it becomes his current day love story. But he has a wife from the future who also came back with him. But she came back later. And because she's been back less time, everybody thinks she's crazy. But she's an artist, and this art that she does is of the future, images from the future in her art. And John's walking down the street with Amy one day, our hero, and he sees this art, and he's immediately taken by, I know this. What is this? I know this art. Who is this person? And he becomes obsessed in wanting to go meet this woman who is staying in a residential treatment in New Mexico. And he travels to New Mexico to go find her and see her. And she sees him, and she doesn't recognize him, but she's incredibly upset by just seeing him because there's some connection between the two of them.
Huh.
And he sees some connection with her, but he's not sure what it is. And then the young guy who's been here from the 50s, who's now much older, recognizes him and says, I've been waiting for you for 25 years. And he says, what the fuck are you talking about? And he says, come here, let me show you. And he explains to him who he is.
Wow.
And anyway, it was it was really a great
Yeah,
movie.
you've sold it to me. Why didn't it happen?
It's a little bit of the Terminator,
Mm.
and a little bit of other, time travel movies with a love story wrapped around it. And what does he do? He's got a wife from the future and a wife from the past. And then there was this other beautiful thing at the future was that, he's like wearing he's got this necklace on, all right? Or does he? Or there's this link between the past and the future and stuff, that when he leaves, he gives this necklace to his wife, who is now pregnant with his child, to give to the child. But when he shows up at something, and this is before I think the kid was born, but when he shows up, he's wearing it, and then he gives it to the kid. And where did he get it from? And it was passed down
Right.
over the generations to him in the future. So there's this cycle, of time travel. Anyway, it was really interesting. So we're going to go make this movie. I left the Jedi early. Matthew was going to direct it. Hal was going to produce it. We were doing it for the Lad Company. I hired Ralph McQuarrie from Star Wars to be one of the conceptual designers. We hired Sid Mead. Do you know who Sid
Yeah,
Mead
I
is?
do know Sid Mead, yeah.
I've got this. I have this beautiful artwork from this movie still. That that people have seen, and it's like they like look at it. It's like you're looking at Ralph stuff and Sid stuff, and the stuff is just eye popping. And they just did. And we hired another guy out of Colorado. His name was Peter Lloyd, who did all this. What's it? I forget. It's painting, airbrush painting. That did of all of these characters and stuff. And we were all ready to make the movie, and we were like moving into production. We had like a $16 million budget, back in 1984. And The Right Stuff came out. And I knew and really liked Phil because I had worked with Phil on Body Snatchers, and Phil, one of my favorite directors, just a wonderful guy. But The Right Stuff is a great movie, but it didn't do well. And the company went under. And the Ladd company came to us, and Laddie said, I can't make this movie by myself. I need a partner. So go find a partner. And Matthew took it to Spielberg. And Steven introduced us to Sid Sheinberg at Universal, who I think we knew. And Sid wanted to make the movie. And Sid said to me, it's too expensive. Cut $2 million out of it. If you can cut $2 million out of it, you can make the movie. Right? And I went back with Matthew and Hal, and I went, I don't know, what do I get $2 million for? I don't know where to find $2 million to make this movie. You want me to cut $2 million out? And I don't know what to do. And we weren't sure where to do it. And for some reason, Matthew and Hal and Jeff Berg, who later became, ran ICM, big agents, was big agent back in the 70s and 80s, said, I'll set you up somewhere else. Don't worry, we'll find another home for you. And we never did. And we never made the movie. And so my story from Close Encounters to The Grid is what I should have said was no. And I should have taken the budget and I should have shook it, and
off that 2 million went, yeah.
And I should have just said, fine, we'll do it. Because I should have known from Steven that, just find the 2 million and go make your movie. Because it's like, it'll be too late anyway. And it's not like Universal can't afford it. And it's not like they're not budgeting it for, which stuff I learned later when I went to work for Sony as an executive, that they're, it's all part of the game. And had we done it, we probably would have made and we were talking it was at the time in the 80s when the great young actors, we were working with a casting director named Wally Masita, who was discovering all of these wonderful young actors like Kevin Kline and Ed Harris and Glenn Close and Michelle Pfeiffer. And we actually took a trip to London to meet Mel Gibson to star in the movie, but he wasn't interested. Either that or something else was going on. Mel was always a little crazy.
Yeah.
But we actually took a weekend trip to London to go meet Mel because he had just finished working on something else. I forget what it was. But that was the kind of cast that we were trying to put together in the early 80s. And
it really feels like a movie that should have existed, Jim.
Doesn't it? It does. I get excited talking about it. I really, I should go talk to the guys again. The problem was that the script had some issues with it. And it was kind of like, who's our villain and what does he want? But it's stuff that you could, but now the problem is, okay, we're going to go make The Grid now. And it's like, well, who owns the script? It's like, who do you go to get, the script is owned by Warner Brothers. So I guess we could, could go pitch it at Warner Brothers as something that should have been made along. And, Hal and Matthew probably could care less about directing it. They would be just happy to see it get made. And you can,
yeah, I'd love to see those Ralph McQuarrie and Sid Mead illustrations. They're incredible. I mean, they're both incredible artists.
They're really quite remarkable.
It's just quite tantalizing, isn't it?
Oh yeah, it was great. Hal and Matthew are wonderful writers. They're really great, and it was just a great script. Great. And anyway, such is life.
How did the Empire Strikes Back job come about? Gary and George had approached you based on what you'd done for them previously?
Well, I'd worked on Graffiti, and then I worked on The Conversation, and George and Gary were around a lot. And I had kept up with the two of them because I liked them, and they were like my first mentors. And I remember in 1977, before Star Wars came out, I was finishing on something. I was probably about to go work on Corvette Summer, and I was in LA, and I had some time, and I called Gary, and he said, "Come on by," and he invited me to Universal. And he said, "Here, I want to show you some stills from Star Wars." And he showed me these black and white stills of Star Wars uh, taken from the film. So the effects work and matte paintings and everything else. And I was just completely blown away by what he showed me. It was just like, I'd never seen anything like it before. It was just amazing. And then I remember the movie coming out. I remember, calling them both and saying how great it was and wonderful. And when I was in Close Encounters, George came down to Mobile to visit Stephen, and I was running the set. So George could see, what I was doing. And I think that what sort of occurred to them was I still lived in Northern California. I was still like a Northern California guy. I had kept up with them, but I hadn't, I had been with them and then left them and pursued a career on my own without them, and had gotten lots of experience with all of these, great directors, Altman and Ashby and Steven and all these people. And so after Corvette Summer, then I was on Invasion of the Body Snatchers, and I think Gary must have come by to say hi or something. And then as I was finishing Body Snatchers, Gary called me, and he said, "I'd like you to come be my assistant on The Empire Strikes Back." And it was like, "Oh, wow, oh, okay." And I said to him, "Gary, this is funny. It's like there's a joke in Hollywood, which is, I've always wanted to direct. Do you know that joke? That was, you know, Mother Teresa dies and goes to heaven, and God says, 'You're so wonderful. Is there anything you've ever wanted to do?' And she says, 'Yeah, I've always wanted to direct.'" So, Gary, that's the short joke, but you can get it. It's like everybody wants to be a director. But I worked with a lot of great directors, and I thought that I could do it. And I said, "Gary, I always thought at this point in my career I would try to be a director as opposed to being a producer." And he said something very smart. He said, "Jim," he said, "anything that you learn working for me about producing these movies can only help you as a director." And I went, I was smart enough to hear good advice when somebody gave it to me. And I said, "Yeah." I said, "You're right." I said, "Yeah, you're right." And so I went to work as the assistant producer on Empire. And what they needed me to do was to, move ILM up from Van Nuys. You've seen the new
Light and Magic, yeah.
Disney stuff?
Hmm.
That's what I said to Dennis when I saw him this morning. I told him how wonderful he was on the Larry Kasdan stuff. I said, "Dennis, you were so great. You were just great." I said, "It was such a treat seeing you and hearing you and, listening to you guys." And, Dennis is very, very humble guy. He didn't, you know, you should, when I get wound up, I tend to gab a lot. So if you need to like tighten me up a little bit.
No, we're good. I think this could be a double episode anyway, because so we were, yeah, you ended up working for Gary and George, and
I worked with Gary and George on Empire, and what they wanted me to do was to get ILM set up, and then Gary wanted me to come over to London and be with him and help out there, and in particular to go help out with the second unit in Norway, because he needed somebody who he trusted in Norway, who understood that it wasn't just live action, but it was live action with visual effects, which is really critical. And so I went to Norway, and it was 2 weeks of first unit. It was supposed to be 3 or 4 weeks of second unit that turned into 8 weeks of second unit, because as always, as the locals say, "Well, it's never been like this before. It's never snowed so much. It's never been this cold. It's never been this far. It's never been anything until the movie company shows up, and the movie company shows up, and it all goes to shit." So anyway, so I spent 8 weeks up in Norway with the second unit, getting all of that work done. And the Norwegian stuff, I'm like, it's like sort of a piece of filmmaking that I'm almost the most proud of in my career, because of the way the stuff is beautiful. It just turned out just great. And I used to argue with Peter McDonald all the time.
oh yeah, I've spoken to Peter. Yeah,
Peter, yeah,
yeah.
we used to argue all the time, because I would say to, Peter would like be setting stuff up in the battle stuff, and I would have to say, "Peter, the thing that's really going to catch the audience's eyes are not these little guys on the ground running. It's going to be those big fucking walkers behind them that are like coming after them, clump, 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 like that. And he was like, I don't think I don't think he never had made, no one had made an effects movie before. It just hadn't been done, but I understood it because I understood ILM and I'd worked on Close Encounters, and I got it. I understood how all that stuff got put together. So we
What
used
what does staying up on in Finzer for how many weeks was it? Did you say?
I think I was there for almost 3 months,
What
February,
does
March.
that do to somebody? I mean,
I'll tell you what does something. The day that I took a train from Finza downhill off the glacier to Voss, and I saw a tree, I started crying when I saw a tree. Because the only thing that I had seen for 10 weeks that was green were the Brussels sprouts on my plate at dinner time. That was the only green I had seen. So because I was in this snow desert of an environment. It was all, it was hot. It was all snow and rocks. Nothing green, nothing at all.
I
And
spoke to Robert Watts. I went and visited him in his house a couple of years ago and interviewed him, and he was telling me, the stuff about just shooting out of the hotel with Mark kind of running around while everyone was trying to stay warm inside. Just having to
exactly,
improvise, in these situations.
that was my idea to Gary when we couldn't shoot. I said to Gary, I said, let's get Harrison up there. Let's get Harrison up here and let's shoot this scene with him and Mark cutting the Tauntaun open, and we'll do it right here outside the hotel. And so that was like one of the Harrison stories, was that the only way to get Harrison up to the location was to send the snowplow train downhill to, I forget to where it was, to another one of the towns east. We were on this Oslo Bergen rail line, and we were the highest point, and they pushed the snow off the track in two directions to keep the track clear. And Harrison flew into Oslo and got on a train and then got to the next station, but there was too much snow and he couldn't get down. So we had to send the snowplow train, which was just an engine, down to this next town to pick him up. And Phil Kohler, who was the location manager, got on the train to go pick up Harrison. And before Phil got on the train, I handed him a bottle of vodka for him and the engineer and Harrison. And there was a tradition in Norway that I learned when I got there, was that we never put the top back on a bottle after it's opened. You open a bottle, you finish it. And when the three of them made it back to Finsa, they like fell off the train. They were so drunk. It was just hysterical to see the three of them just like falling off the train and into the snow, but at least Harrison was there and we were able to shoot that sequence, which we never would have been able to shoot. But so I guess what's kind of interesting about that, I mean, I'll look back on in retrospect, because in my career, I, having worked on Graffiti, Conversation, Thieves Like Us, and all these movies on location, I never worked on a studio movie until I worked on Thieves Like Us, which we shot at MGM Hollywood. I'd never been to LA to work on a movie before. Everything was always on location. And so, and it was true of the Streets of San Francisco TV show, which is when, and I'll give you something to contrast this to. When you needed something, you got it. You didn't pick up the phone and call the prop department, or this department or that department and say, drive this over, bring this to me. It's like I need something. It's like, well, let's figure out how to do it. Let's figure out how to shoot around it. What do we do to, that was my background in filmmaking. It wasn't in, call the prop department and tell them we need to bring the widget over. And it was interesting because I remember when you were interviewing Howard said to you, I think he said to you, he said, I grew up in the studio system. I grew up on the lot at Universal, and it was great because when you needed something, you just picked up the phone and you called the friend, and it was like, yeah, that's one way to do it, but it wasn't, anyway, it wasn't how I learned how to make movies. It was like, you need it, go get it. You need it, improvise it. You need it, shoot around it, figure out a way to make it work, that kind of a background, which I, appreciated. So it was very, very different. It was very different for me when I actually did go to LA and I did work on, on the lot doing studio stuff. It's a very different kind of experience, which was also true when I worked on, and this is something I was going to talk to you about, and we could save it for another part of the conversation. You asked me to last time we were talking to sort of reflect on filmmaking and me and my experience with it. I was watching what's the Hollywood movie with Brad Pitt and Leonardo DiCaprio, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood.
Yeah.
They made a few years ago, and and I hadn't seen it before, and I watched it, and it was so interesting to me because it captured the milieu of working on television in Hollywood with the people and the actors. And it was all stuff that I was never exposed to until I worked on the Streets of San Francisco TV show, where I was working with TV production people and actors who worked on television all the time. And it was just so dead on what was happening to DiCaprio's character as it evolved in the movie, and Brad Pitt, who was his stunt man and used to drive him to work and take care of him. And it was the kind of stuff that I used to see. I sort of understood that, what happens to actors when they're successful early and then they go into TV and they have a hit show that goes off the air and they're trying to keep their careers, moving forward. And it's like all of the people on the sidelines of the movie business, and then all of those, those strange hippies who are living up the hill and living out, on the set. And Bruce Dern, who I had worked with on Coming Home, who I adore, who's very, very funny. Bruce got his start as a production assistant before he became an actor. Bruce always used to fuck with us on Coming Home. He would come up to us in the middle of the day, and because he came out of like the production department, so he'd come up to me and he'd say, "All right, what time's my call tomorrow?" And I go, "Huh?" He said, "Yeah, Hal just told me I could go. I'm done. I'm done for the." And he was bullshitting me. He was just he was just setting me up. So I pick up my walkie-talkie and I called Chuck and I go, "Bruce is here and he's telling me he's wrapped for the day." And Chuck would go, "What? What the fuck are you talking about?" And Bruce would be there like, he'd be getting a chuckle out of it. I'll tell you two other, if I can, because you've got me going. I'll tell you two other walkie-talkie stories. When on Invasion of the Body Snatchers, Leonard Nimoy was on the show. And Leonard, another really great actor, but everybody knows him as Spock, but just for the hell of it. My second AD on Body Snatchers was a guy named Toby Lavallo, who used to do this great Scotty imitation from Star Trek. And so I said, I think it was like toward the end of Leonard being on the show, maybe his second to last day or last day. And I said, "Toby, I'm going to go stand next to Leonard. And when I double click my walkie-talkie, I want you to, come over the radio and, give us a Scotty imitation." So he went, "Oh, okay, fine." And so maybe he was somewhere else watching, and I went over and stood next to Leonard. And I was just, how you doing, Leonard?" "Oh, I'm okay. I'm fine," and stuff. And we just sort of stood there standing next to each other. And I turned my volume up and I double clicked my radio. And Toby came over the walkie-talkie and he went, "Captain Spock, we're out of dilithium crystals." The classic line. And I was a huge Star Trek fan when I was growing up. When I was a teenager, just a kid, I used to, eat my dinner watching in front of the TV set so I could watch Star Trek because it was so much fun. It's like, "We're out of dilithium crystals." And I knew Leonard heard me because I turned the volume up. And I looked at Leonard because he knew I was fucking with him. And Leonard looked at me like Spock. He looked at me like this out of the corner of his eye, and he raised his eyebrow like Spock does. And then he looked away. Just like it was really classic. Just
Nice.
that. And then I had another problem. This is another story. This was not necessarily a good story. I don't know if you want to put this in the thing or not. When I was an assistant director trainee on Streets, oftentimes there were these, which is one of the great things about Streets, was that Quinn Martin, who had been around forever, invited older actresses up to work on the TV show. So, and actors too. So I'll give you two quick stories. Ida Lupino was a leading lady. I met Ida Lupino and I knew who she was. And she was one of the first women feature directors. And not only that, she was still beautiful and charming and I used to talk to her all the time on the set. And it was what a treat for me to meet Ida Lupino. This is a real movie star. And also when I grew up, I used to watch after Saturday afternoon movies on WOR TV. It was Channel 9 in New York. It was like the big movie channel. They'd always show movies in the afternoon. And I absolutely loved Gunga Din. Just loved Gunga Din. It was one of my favorite movies. And who comes up to be a guest star on the TV show but Sam Jaffe, who was Gunga Din? And I was like completely starstruck that I got to meet Sam Jaffe. I occasionally get starstruck. It's happened times when I meet certain actors, not many, but some. So Sam Jaffe was one of them. Meeting Carl and working with Carl, was certainly one of them. These other guys I grew up with, so it wasn't a big deal. Harrison Ford or whoever, Richard Dreyfuss. I knew these guys when they were all kids. So that it wasn't the same thing. But once on coming home, Jane Fonda invited Henry to the set. And meeting Henry Fonda was like, whoa, that was like, what a treat it was to meet. I never got to work with him. Years later, when they made On Golden Pond, they called me because they needed an assistant director. Something wasn't working. And they asked me to come onto the show to either take over for somebody or something. And it would have been with Jane and Henry Fonda. And I think Mark Rydell was the director. And I couldn't because something else was happening. And I said I was flattered that they asked me. But anyway, meeting Henry was just this real trip. Anyway, so on Streets, there was another time. There was an actress whose name was Signe Hasso, Hasso, and she was from the 40s, 50s. Very well-known, beautiful actress, and she was coming up to do a show, and she still had her sort of star mentality about her. So she was always showing up late to work, which is like deadly on a TV show because you got to hit you're screwed. And back then it was nothing with cell phones and stuff. And so, the first AD, who was this older guy, got me on the radio and he said, send a car to go pick up Signe. We got to get her down here to go to work. I said, okay. And I went to the phone and everything was on public telephone. So you'd have to find a grocery store, get the telephone, you put your money in and dial and call the hotel and, hi, Miss Hasso, we've got a car waiting downstairs for you to pick you up and bring you to the set. We're ready for you. And Mrs. Hasso was like, oh, darling, I'm just right in the middle of something. I need another 15 to 20 minutes, please. Would you just tell them to wait for me? And that's like, no, I can't say that. I went, well, hold on one second. And I've got Signe on the phone here, and I got my walkie-talkie here. This is really, I really fucked up. And I get the first AD on the phone, and I went, Carl, I've got Signe on the phone, and she says she needs another 15 to 20 minutes until she's ready to get in the car. Well, Carl doesn't know I've got that,
Yeah.
I've got communication devices, right? And Carl says, you tell that old bitch to get her fat ass in the car. And I'm like this, like, here I am, this, 21-year-old kid, like looking at these two devices. Anyway, poor Carl. That was his last episode on the show.
Oh, no.
Because Signe was a close friend of Quinn Martin's, and it was like, So, anyway.
Oh, man. That was like, you want the earth to swallow you up moment.
Yeah, I was pretty embarrassed. I think there's probably more to it than that, why they replaced Carl. But what was funny is that I think they replaced Carl and then they brought Chuck Myers in to be on the show. So that was like a treat for me that I got to work with Chuck.
Well, I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Jim Bloom there. Part 2 will be the next episode, number 62, the first proper episode of November 2022. If you enjoyed that and you enjoy my work, it is work, and it is just me, my laptop and a guest, and my microphone and my headphones and Adobe Premiere and Audio Hijack and a bunch of software. I would appreciate your support. For $1 or more per month, you can help ensure this podcast continues to grow from strength to strength. And I hope the guests I've had on recently gives you some impression of it going in that direction more and more as time passes. Check out patreon.com/Jamie Benning to see different tiers of support available. For some of those tiers, you'll get some merchandise too, so take a look and see what you think. If you can't support the podcast financially, I'd really appreciate if you could review it on Apple Podcasts. That's the best way, apparently, to get this to more eyes and hopefully ears. Equally, sharing my tweets or Instagram posts would be appreciated. I'm Jamie SWB, that used to stand for Star Wars Begins, one of my Filmumentaries, on Twitter, and Filmumentaries on Instagram and Facebook. Next episode, I should have some news for you on the Kickstarter campaign for the feature-length documentary that we hope to release soon. I'm so excited to share it with you. We've been working away behind the scenes, trying to get this all ready, and I'm so looking forward to getting stuck into making it when we reach our funding goal. Let's be positive about this. Anyway, thanks for joining me, and I hope you can do so again for the next episode of the Filmumentaries podcast.